The first punch sent the Dominion enforcer sprawling. The second crushed his windpipe before he could call for backup. Commander Rael Kovach didn't stop moving. His body was a machine honed by years of war, a weapon that didn't need steel to be deadly. He pivoted, caught the third enforcer by the wrist, twisted, and wrenched the alien's shoulder from its socket. A sharp cry of pain rang through the dimly lit alleyway, followed by a sickening crunch as Rael silenced him. The last of them charged, a blade flashing in the neon haze of the colony's underbelly. Rael sidestepped, gripped the attacker's arm, and drove his knee into the soldier's face. Bones shattered. The bodies lay motionless at his feet. Rael exhaled, rolling his shoulders, shaking off the familiar thrill of combat. He turned, only to find himself under the piercing silver gaze of the woman he had just saved. Sylva Rin-Tor stood frozen, her bioluminescent markings pulsing a slow, flickering rhythm of shock. The glow from the streetlights reflected off her sapphire blue skin, making her look almost ethereal, otherworldly. Which of course she was. She had been cornered moments from capture, and now in the span of heartbeats the four enforcers were gone. You just... Her voice was soft, but her body was taut, ready to bolt. Rael wiped his bloody knuckles on his jacket. "You're welcome." Sylva's glowing eyes narrowed. "You killed them with your hands. They had weapons. I adapted." Her breath came shallow, her fingers twitching as if running calculations in her mind. Rael had seen that look before, cold logic assessing variables, seeking risk factors. A scientist, not a soldier. He tilted his head slightly, watching her, reading the unease in the way she held herself. "You're not Dominion," she finally said. Rael huffed. "Not anymore." Sylva's gaze flickered to the bodies again. "Why did you help me?" He could have walked away. He should have. Getting involved with a Vashari fugitive was the last thing he needed. But he had spent too many years running, and for some reason, something about her hesitation, her guarded expression, made him answer truthfully. "Because you needed it." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then the sound of heavy boots echoed down the alleyway. Reinforcements. Sylva's eyes widened. "We have to go." It was an admission, however unspoken. Rael nodded, motioning for her to follow. They sprinted through the maze of the colony's underworld, dodging flickering neon signs and weaving between rusting machinery. The Dominion's presence here was suffocating. Too many eyes, too many ears. They reached a docking bay on the far end of the station. Sylva hesitated as Rael led her toward a battered ship nestled in the shadows. The obsidian dawn wasn't much to look at. Her hull was scarred, her plating barely holding, but she was fast. She had kept Rael alive, and that was enough. "Get in," he ordered, lowering the boarding ramp. Sylva hesitated. "I don't even know who you are." Rael glanced over his shoulder. Dominion officers were already spreading through the docking bay, scanning for movement. "You can either ask questions or you can live long enough to get answers." That was enough to make up her mind. She stepped inside. Rael sealed the hatch behind them. The obsidian dawn roared to life, her engines rattling from the stress of a rapid takeoff. Rael pushed the thrusters to their limit, breaking free of the station's artificial gravity. Outside, the void stretched endless and black, a sea of stars shimmering like distant ghosts. Sylva exhaled, pressing a hand to her forehead. "They'll track us." Rael leaned back in his chair, scanning the ship's monitors. "They'll try." She studied him, still wary. "You're a soldier." "Was." He ran a hand through his hair. "Not anymore." Sylva didn't look convinced. "No civilian fights like that." Rael smirked. "And no scientist runs from the Dominion unless they have something worth chasing." Sylva tensed. He had struck a nerve. She turned away, focusing on the viewport instead. Rael let the silence settle. He wasn't going to pry, not yet. Whatever trouble she was in, it was big, bigger than him. But he had made a choice when he stepped into that alleyway, and there was no turning back now. Sylva paced the length of the obsidian dawn's cockpit, her bioluminescent markings pulsing in erratic rhythms. She wasn't used to this, being trapped out of control at the mercy of a human she didn't know. Rael, meanwhile, sat in the pilot's chair, adjusting the ship's course with an almost lazy efficiency. The silence between them stretched, tense and unspoken. He didn't push her for information. He didn't need to. The way she clenched her jaw, the way she folded her arms tightly against her body said enough. She was hiding something. Finally, she stopped packing. "They'll send more," she muttered, almost to herself. "They never stop." Rael didn't look at her. "Then we make sure they can't find us." Sylva turned sharply. You don't even know what they want. Rael exhaled, rolling his shoulders. I don't need to, I know how they operate. The Dominion doesn't chase someone unless they have something valuable. Sylva's silver eyes locked onto his. And what if I do? Then I make sure they don't take it. The words hung between them, heavier than they should have been. Sylva studied him, looking for deception. She found none. That unsettled her more than anything. She crossed her arms. I don't need saving, Rael smirked. Good, I'm not in the saving business. That earned him a dry, almost bitter laugh. Sylva leaned against the bulkhead, exhaling slowly. The glow of her markings dimmed slightly. You were Dominion, she finally said. It wasn't a question. Rael's expression darkened. A long time ago. And now you run. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Sylva sighed, rubbing her temples. This is a mistake. Probably, Rael admitted. But you're already here, and unless you have another ship hidden somewhere, you're stuck with me. She scowled but didn't argue. Instead, she looked out the viewport at the endless black of space. I need to get to the Vashari border, she murmured. Rael shook his head. Not happening. Sylva snapped her gaze to him. What? The Dominion controls every hyperlane leading to Vashari space, he said flatly. The moment we enter, they'll burn us out of the sky. Sylva's fingers curled into fists. I don't have a choice. Rael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. There's always a choice. She shook her head. Not this time. Something in her voice, something raw, desperate, made Rael pause. He didn't know what she was running from, but he knew the sound of someone with nothing left to lose. He had heard it in himself once. He exhaled through his nose. Tell me what's in your head. Sylva hesitated. Then finally, I stole something. Rael arched a brow. Something important, I take it, she nodded. The Dominion has been developing a new energy core, a prototype capable of powering entire fleets or destroying them. Her voice was quiet, haunted. I was part of the team that built it. When I realized what they intended to use it for, I ran. Rael let out a slow breath. And you have the core. Sylva reached into the folds of her jacket and pulled out a small, palm-sized device. It hummed with a faint, eerie light. Rael let out a low whistle. That's a death sentence. She smirked humorlessly. Tell me something I don't know. Rael leaned back, running a hand through his hair. You really expect to get this thing to Vashari space? Yes, she said firmly. If I can get it to my people, we can dismantle it, make sure the Dominion can't use it. Rael studied her. And what if they already have backups? They don't, she sounded certain. This was the only prototype. That's why they want it back so badly. Rael drummed his fingers against the console, thinking, this wasn't just some runaway scientist. This was the kind of trouble that didn't just go away. Finally, he sighed. All right, Sylva blinked. What? I'll get you there. Her expression flickered between surprise and suspicion. Just like that, Rael smirked. I'm not doing this for free. I have a feeling you know more about Dominion tech than you're letting on. Sylva's lips pressed together, but she didn't deny it. Rael leaned forward. You help me upgrade my ship, make sure we don't get fried before we reach the border. In return, I get you where you need to go. Sylva hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. Deal. Rael held out a hand. Sylva eyed it warily before finally clasping it. Her fingers were cool against his palm. For the first time, the tension between them shifted, not gone, but different. Less hostile, more uncertain. Rael released her hand and turned back to the controls. Get some rest, he said. It's a long trip. Sylva didn't argue, but as she stepped away, she glanced back at him, her glowing eyes unreadable. Rael felt the weight of her gaze long after she was gone. Rael sat in the dim glow of the obsidian dawn's control panel, hands resting loosely over the ship's worn-out controls. Space stretched before him, silent, endless, filled with the kind of darkness he had grown used to. He had been flying alone for so long that the presence of another person on his ship felt strange, almost foreign, especially someone like her. He glanced over his shoulder. Sylva was in the corner of the cockpit, hunched over a hollow interface she had pulled from her wrist. Thin streams of blue light flickered as she cycled through schematics, the soft glow of her bioluminescent markings pulsing in thought. You always work this late? Rael asked, breaking the silence. Sylva didn't look up. Always. Going to burn yourself out. She exhaled, a soft breath of amusement. That's rich coming from a man who just killed 4 soldiers without breaking a sweat. Rael smirked. Fair point. Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't as heavy. He watched as Sylva's hands worked deftly, her fingers tapping out calculations faster than he could keep up with. She was fast, efficient. He had met engineers before, good ones, but none who worked like this. It wasn't just knowledge, it was instinct. Finally, he leaned forward. "What are you building?" Sylva hesitated, then turned the hollow display toward him. "Your ship's energy shielding is outdated. If we try to cross Dominion-controlled space with this, we'll be fried before we hit the first checkpoint." Rael arched a brow. "And you think you can fix it?" She glanced at him, eyes gleaming silver in the dim light. "I know I can," he huffed. "Confident." "Efficient," she corrected. Rael studied the display. The schematics were complex, beyond what his ship should have been capable of. But Sylva wasn't just patching things, she was redesigning them. He frowned, narrowing his gaze. "This isn't standard Dominion tech," she hesitated. "No," Rael leaned back, arms crossed. "So what is it?" Sylva's fingers curled slightly over the edge of the hollow projection. "Vashari engineering." Rael let out a low whistle. "Didn't know your people shared their tech." "They don't." She didn't elaborate. Rael didn't push. Instead, he exhaled, glancing back at the controls. "How long?" "A few hours to install, assuming your ship's framework can handle the power conversion." Rael smirked. "Guess we're about to find out." They worked together in the ship's underbelly, crawling through maintenance panels, rerouting circuits, and adjusting the energy core's output. Rael had never seen anyone work the way Sylva did. She didn't just understand the technology, she anticipated it, molding it like an extension of herself. At one point, as she reached for a power conduit, her arm brushed against his. The contact was brief, but enough to send a flicker of warmth through him. He ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. Sylva, however, stilled. She glanced at him, her bioluminescent markings pulsing faintly, almost hesitantly. Rael met her gaze. "Something wrong?" Sylva hesitated. Then slowly she shook her head. "No," but something in her expression had shifted. They worked in silence after that, the unspoken weight between them heavier than before. Eventually, as the last connection was made, Sylva exhaled, sitting back against the bulkhead. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on her sapphire skin, her breath steady but tired. "That should do it." Rael tapped a few commands into the ship's console. The energy shields flickered, then flared to life, stronger than before. He let out a low whistle. "Not bad." Sylva smirked, the hint of pride in her eyes. "Told you." Rael chuckled. "Guess I owe you one." She tilted her head slightly, that same curious motion he had noticed before. "Why are you helping me?" Rael paused. He hadn't really thought about it. He could have left her back on the colony, let the Dominion take care of her. He didn't owe her anything, and yet here they were. Finally, he exhaled. "Because you needed it." Sylva studied him, her silver eyes unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. She didn't thank him, she didn't need to. Instead, she stood, stretching slightly. "I should rest." Rael watched as she disappeared down the corridor, the glow of her markings fading into the shadows. He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. He had spent years running, avoiding, surviving. But for the first time in a long time, he wondered if he had finally found something worth stopping for. Rael woke to the distant hum of the Obsidian Dawn's engines, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat in the void. He had dozed off in the pilot's chair, arms crossed, boots propped against the control panel. Old habits. Light sleep, always ready to move, but something was different this time. A presence. Sylva stood near the viewport, bathed in the glow of passing starlight. Her back was to him, her violet hair shifting subtly with the ship's vibrations. The bioluminescent markings on her arms pulsed in slow, measured intervals like a quiet storm beneath her skin. Rael rubbed his face, sitting up. "Can't sleep." Sylva didn't turn. "I don't sleep like humans do," Rael frowned. "What does that mean?" She hesitated, then glanced over her shoulder. "Vashari don't enter full unconsciousness. We enter a meditative state, rest without vulnerability." Her gaze flickered, thoughtful. "It's a survival adaptation," Rael huffed. "That explains a lot." Sylva finally turned to face him fully, leaning back against the viewport frame. "And you were a soldier, weren't you? Do you ever sleep?" Rael rolled his shoulders, feeling the stiffness in his muscles. "Not well." Sylva studied him, her glowing silver eyes unreadable. Then after a moment she said, "You don't talk about your past." Rael smirked faintly. "Neither do you." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Fair." They lapsed into silence, the weight of the stars pressing in around them. It was strange, Rael thought, how easy the quiet felt with her now. He had spent so long alone, keeping his distance, avoiding attachments. But here, in the cold dark of space, with a fugitive scientist who should have been nothing more than cargo, he felt steady. Sylva exhaled, her fingers grazing the edge of the viewport. I was born on a world that no longer belongs to my people. Her voice was softer now, distant. The Dominion came under the guise of peace, trade, collaboration. We welcomed them. A flicker of bitterness passed through her expression. And then, when they had what they needed, they took the rest. Rael watched her, saying nothing. She swallowed, jaw tightening. I believed in progress, in science. I thought if we just worked with them, we could find balance, a future. Her gaze darkened. I was wrong. Rael leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. The energy core, Sylva nodded. The Dominion wanted a weapon. They didn't tell us, but I saw the signs, the blueprints, the calculations, what they were really designing. She exhaled. So I took it, I ran. Rael exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her words settle. And now they'll never stop. No, her voice was quiet but firm. They won't. Rael could hear it, the guilt, the responsibility she carried. She had done the right thing, but it had cost her everything. He knew that feeling all too well. He tilted his head. So why Vashari space? Sylva hesitated. Because my people still have allies. There are those who would fight if given the chance. And because it's home. A wry smile touched her lips. Or what's left of it? Rael leaned back, studying her. And if we get there, what happens then? Sylva's fingers curled against the viewport. Then I make sure this technology is destroyed before the Dominion can replicate it. Rael let out a low whistle. That's a hell of a gamble. Sylva met his gaze. You said it yourself. There's always a choice. Something flickered in his chest, something sharp, familiar. He had spent years convincing himself that choices didn't matter, that no matter what path he took, the past would always chase him. But Sylva believed in something, and she was willing to fight for it. He hadn't met someone like that in a long, long time. He smirked slightly. You're not what I expected. Sylva arched a brow. What did you expect? Rael shrugged. Someone more desperate, scared. She tilted her head, considering him. I am scared. The admission was quiet but unwavering. But fear doesn't decide what happens next. I do. Rael's smirk faded. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized this wasn't just survival for her. It wasn't just about running. It was about taking back something that had been stolen. It was about reclaiming something bigger than herself. And maybe, just maybe, Rael was starting to feel the pull of that fight too. Sylva shifted, brushing a stray strand of violet hair from her face. You should rest, she murmured. We still have a long way to go. Rael didn't argue. He leaned back, folding his arms, but his mind was already turning. He had told himself he was just getting her to safety, but now he wasn't so sure. And for the first time in years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had something to fight for again. The alert blared through the cockpit, sharp and insistent. Rael was on his feet in an instant, scanning the ship's monitors. Incoming, he muttered. His fingers flew over the controls, bringing up a tactical display. The Dominion's signature was unmistakable, 3 Hunter-class ships closing fast. Sylva appeared at his side, her bioluminescent markings pulsing in quick succession, her breath just a little too steady to be natural. She was afraid. They found us. Her voice was quiet but firm. Rael exhaled sharply. Guess your tracking wipe wasn't as clean as you thought. She shot him a glare but said nothing. Rael's mind worked fast. They couldn't outrun Hunter-class ships, not in a straight chase. Obsidian Dawn was built for speed, but not against specialized Dominion interceptors. Strap in, he said, already pulling the ship into a sharp turn. Sylva braced herself as the artificial gravity adjusted, her eyes darting across the displays. They're closing the gap. We need a jump vector. No time, Rael cut in. His gaze flicked to the asteroid field on the edge of the sector, dense and unpredictable. A death trap if you didn't know how to fly through one. He smirked. Hold on. The ship lurched forward as he diverted all remaining power to the thrusters. The Dominion ships adjusted course, pursuing without hesitation. They're not backing off, Sylva muttered. They never do. Rael's grip on the controls was firm, steady. His body was tense, but his eyes were sharp, alive in a way Sylva hadn't seen before. He wasn't just flying, he was hunting. Sylva swallowed, turning her attention to the defense systems. Shields are holding, but if they get a weapons lock, they won't. Rael pushed the ship into the asteroid field, weaving between massive, tumbling rock formations with impossible precision. Sylva's fingers clenched the edge of the console. The Dominion ships followed. Their pilots were skilled but not reckless. They were calculating, waiting for him to make a mistake. Rael grinned. "Come on, you bastards, follow me in." He pulled the Obsidian Dawn into a tighter pass, skimming an asteroid so closely that the ship's hull vibrated. The Dominion ships hesitated, adjusting their trajectories. Sylva's fingers danced over the hollow display. "They're trying to force us into open space." Rael's smirk widened. "Yeah, let's not do that." He flipped a series of switches, cutting primary thrusters for a fraction of a second. The ship's inertia carried them forward. Then he spun the Obsidian Dawn on its axis, reversing momentum instantly. Sylva barely had time to process the movement before Rael fired the aft thrusters, sending them backward toward the pursuing ships. The Dominion pilots hesitated, just for a second. It was all Rael needed. He rolled the ship, positioning their trajectory toward an incoming asteroid cluster. The Dominion pilots, caught off guard, scrambled to adjust. Two weren't fast enough. The first slammed into a drifting asteroid, its hull crumpling under the impact before detonating in a burst of fire. The second clipped a jagged rock formation, spinning wildly before colliding with a larger mass. Another explosion. The third ship wavered, pulling back. Rael smirked. "That's what I thought." Sylva let out a slow breath, her hands trembling slightly as she processed what just happened. She caught herself, shook her head. "You planned that." Rael stretched his fingers over the controls, rolling his shoulders. "Mostly." Sylva exhaled, watching the remaining Dominion ship retreat. "They're regrouping, they'll be back." Rael nodded. "Yeah, but not before we make our next move." Sylva turned to him, her silver eyes still wide. She had spent her life trusting logic equations, controlled variables. And then there was Rael, improvising in the face of death, making snap decisions that defied probability, and surviving. She shook her head, an incredulous smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You're insane," Rael grinned. "So they tell me." Sylva studied him, a strange warmth settling in her chest. She hadn't trusted him when they met. She still wasn't sure she did. But for the first time, she wasn't so sure she didn't. Rael shut down the alert systems, letting the ship's internal hum settle into something calmer. The asteroid field stretched beyond the viewport, a graveyard of drifting rock and forgotten debris. It would buy them time, but not forever. Sylva exhaled, stepping back from the console. Her bioluminescent markings had dimmed slightly, no longer pulsing in that frantic rhythm. She was regaining control. Rael turned to her. "You all right?" She shot him a look. "We were nearly vaporized." He smirked. "Yeah, but we were." Sylva shook her head, muttering something in her native tongue. It didn't sound flattering. Rael leaned back in his seat. "Admit it, you didn't think we'd make it." Sylva hesitated. "No, I didn't," Rael chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Good to know I'm still full of surprises." Sylva crossed her arms. "That's one way to put it." He could tell she was still processing what had just happened. Her kind weren't soldiers. Vashari were strategists, engineers, thinkers. But this was war. Fast, violent, unpredictable. And she had just gotten a front-row seat to how he survived it. Finally, she turned away, running a hand through her violet hair. "We need a real plan." Rael nodded, pulling up the navigation charts. "We make for the nearest shadowport. If we're lucky, we can refuel and resupply before Dominion forces regroup." Sylva frowned. "And if we're not lucky," Rael gave her a crooked grin. "Then we improvise," Sylva huffed. "I hate that word," Rael chuckled. "I figured," she sighed, leaning over the console. "This is reckless," Rael shrugged. "It's survival." Sylva studied him for a moment, her silver eyes searching. "Do you ever stop running?" Something in his expression flickered, but it was gone too fast for her to catch. "Haven't had a reason to." Sylva's markings pulsed faintly, as if sensing the weight behind his words. "And if you did," Rael held her gaze. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned his focus back to the controls. "We should get moving." Sylva watched him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Agreed." She settled into the co-pilot's seat, fingers gliding over the interface. "You'll need me to reroute power distribution if we want to stay off Dominion scanners." Rael raised a brow. "Thought you hated improvising." Sylva shot him a sideways glance. "Doesn't mean I'm bad at it." Rael smirked. "Now that I believe." They worked in tandem, the hum of the ship filling the space between them. The tension from before had shifted, not gone, but changed. Something unspoken had settled between them. They were in this together now. And for the first time in a long time, Rael wasn't sure if that scared him, or if he liked it. The Obsidian Dawn slipped through the asteroid field, the ship's modified shielding dispersing just enough energy to keep them hidden from Dominion scans. The Shadowport was still several hours away, but for now, they were ghosts. Sylva worked beside Rael in the cockpit, fingers gliding over the control panels with quiet precision. Every so often, the glow of her bioluminescent markings would flicker as she concentrated, illuminating her sapphire-blue skin in a way that Rael found distracting. He shook the thought away. Focus. They weren't out of danger yet. "You've done this before," Sylva muttered, adjusting the ship's energy distribution. Rael smirked. "What, running for my life more times than I'd like?" Sylva shot him a glance. "No, I mean this, dodging scans, moving through dead zones, hiding in places Dominion ships won't follow." She paused. "You weren't just a soldier, you were something else." Rael exhaled. He had known this question was coming. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "I was an executioner." Sylva stiffened. Rael kept his eyes on the controls, but he could feel her staring at him. "Elite unit," he continued. "No names, no records. We handled problems before they became problems." Sylva's voice was quiet. "And what made you leave?" Rael's grip on the throttle tightened. "One day the problem was me." The silence stretched, thick with things unsaid. Then Sylva turned back to the console. "And now?" Rael's smirk was bitter. "Now I fly." Sylva nodded slowly. She didn't press, didn't demand more. But there was something in her expression, understanding maybe, or recognition. She knew what it was like to walk away from something that once defined you. After a long beat, she exhaled. "I reconfigured the sensor array," she said, shifting the subject. "We'll appear as a derelict vessel on long-range Dominion scans. Should buy us time." Rael glanced at her, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Not bad." Sylva arched a brow. "I am a scientist." Rael chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, a scientist on the run with stolen tech, hijacking my ship systems like a damn hacker." Sylva smirked. "Efficient." Rael grinned. "Dangerous." For a moment they simply looked at each other. The flickering lights of the control panel cast shifting shadows across her face, and for the first time Rael realized how close they were sitting. Sylva seemed to realize it too. Her fingers hovered over the console, hesitating. The glow of her markings pulsed faintly, betraying something unspoken. Rael swallowed. The moment stretched. Then the proximity alarm blared. Rael snapped forward, scanning the radar. A single blip, small, moving fast. Sylva's expression tightened. "Another ship," Rael frowned. "Not Dominion." He tapped a few keys, magnifying the reading. Sylva inhaled sharply. "That's a beacon." Rael's jaw clenched. Someone was signaling, and they were close. Sylva straightened. "It could be a distress call." Rael exhaled sharply. "Or it could be a trap." Sylva hesitated. "We have to check." Rael shot her a look. "No, we don't." Sylva set her jaw. "If someone is out there, we can't just leave them." Rael ran a hand through his hair, glaring at the screen. He had spent years staying out of trouble, keeping his head down. But now he wasn't alone. And something about the way Sylva was looking at him made him curse under his breath. He adjusted the ship's trajectory. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's take a look." Sylva nodded, already rerouting power to the scanners. As the Obsidian Dawn veered toward the beacon, Rael exhaled, shaking his head. "What the hell am I doing?" But deep down, he already knew. He was making a choice. And for the first time in years, it wasn't just for himself. The Obsidian Dawn cut through the dark, gliding toward the beacon like a predator stalking unseen prey. The proximity alert pinged steadily, each pulse drawing them closer to whatever or whoever was out there. Rael's hands were steady on the controls, but his jaw was tight. He didn't like this, not one bit. Sylva leaned forward, fingers working over the scanner interface. "No Dominion signals in range," she murmured. "It's strange. The beacon isn't automated, it's being manually transmitted." Rael's eyes flicked to her. "Someone's alive." Sylva nodded. "If it were a pre-recorded distress call, the pattern would be uniform. This is inconsistent, slight variations in frequency." Her bioluminescent markings pulsed faintly. "It's deliberate," Rael sighed. "Or it's bait." Sylva hesitated. "It could be both." The warning in her voice was clear. She didn't want to ignore it, but she wasn't naive either. Rael had to admit she was sharper than he had given her credit for. He tightened his grip on the controls. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The ship's external lights flickered on, cutting through the void to reveal the source of the beacon. A small escape pod. It drifted, spinning slowly, its exterior charred and dented from what looked like weapons fire. The hull plating bore no official insignia, no Dominion markings, no faction identifiers. Just a single blinking light still pulsing its weak distress call. Sylva adjusted the scanners. I'm picking up one life sign, weak. Rael exhaled through his nose. Damn it. Everything about this screamed trap, but he glanced at Sylva. Her silver eyes were locked on the pod, her expression unreadable, but the faint glow of her markings betrayed her unease. She wasn't a soldier, but she understood what this could be. Still, she had been the one to say it first. We can't just leave them. Rael muttered a curse under his breath. All right, let's bring it in. Sylva exhaled, relieved, but didn't say anything. She simply nodded and began preparing the docking procedure. Rael maneuvered the obsidian dawn carefully, using the ship's stabilizers to latch onto the pod. The hull vibrated slightly as the magnetic clamps locked into place. Sylva tapped into the comms, attempting to open a channel. A burst of static filled the cockpit before a garbled voice came through. Weak, distorted, but unmistakably human. Can, hear me? Sylva leaned forward. You're transmitting on an open frequency. Identify yourself. A long pause, then, help. Sylva glanced at Rael. Rael sighed. We're opening it. He unfastened his harness and pushed himself to his feet, already regretting the decision. He didn't like taking chances, but something about that voice, it wasn't Dominion, and it sure as hell didn't sound like someone setting a trap. Sylva followed close behind as they moved toward the docking bay. The air was heavy with tension. Rael kept his hand near his sidearm as he pressed the panel to open the hatch. The escape pod's outer door hissed, depressurizing. Inside, slumped against the bulkhead, was a man, human, barely conscious. His clothes were torn, blood staining his sleeve where a wound had crusted over. His breathing was shallow, his face gaunt. Rael's instincts flared. The man wasn't Dominion. He wasn't even armed. Sylva crouched beside him immediately, scanning him with a small device from her belt. His vitals are unstable. He needs treatment. Rael narrowed his eyes. Who the hell are you? The man groaned, his eyelids fluttering open. For a moment he looked past them, disoriented. Then his gaze settled on Rael. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition. Kovach. Rael stiffened. Sylva's head snapped toward him. You know him? Rael's throat felt tight. He hadn't heard that voice in years. The man coughed weakly, trying to sit up. Didn't think I'd see you again. Sylva's eyes darted between them, her mind working fast. Rael. Rael forced himself to breathe, forced himself to look at the man he had once fought beside, Terk Voss, a name from a past he had tried to bury, and now here he was, bleeding out on his ship. Sylva's voice cut through the heavy silence. You said the Dominion doesn't leave loose ends, so why is one of yours still breathing? Rael didn't answer. Because he didn't know, and that terrified him more than anything. Terk's breathing was shallow, but his gaze was sharp, too sharp for a dying man. Rael knew that look. It wasn't desperation, it was survival. Sylva's silver eyes flickered between them, her bioluminescent markings pulsing in a slow, calculating rhythm. We need to get him to the medbay. Rael didn't move. He just stared down at the man who should have been dead. No, Sylva stiffened. He won't last much longer. That's not my problem, Rael muttered. Terk coughed weakly, a faint, bitter smile tugging at his cracked lips. Still the same bastard, huh? Rael clenched his jaw. His grip on the sidearm at his hip tightened. How the hell are you alive? Terk let out a ragged breath, wincing as he shifted against the bulkhead. Long story. Rael wasn't in the mood for long stories. Give me the short version. Terk exhaled through his nose, closing his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. I was part of an escort fleet moving classified cargo, he rasped. We were ambushed, no survivors, Rael frowned. Then how are you here? Terk cracked an eye open. Because I was the classified cargo. Sylva's markings flickered in alarm. What? Terk coughed again, swallowing hard. The Dominion been running experiments, cybernetic integration, neural rewiring. They don't just want soldiers, they want weapons. Rael felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Terk lifted a shaking hand, pulling down the torn fabric of his sleeve. Beneath it, metal gleamed in the dim light. His entire forearm was synthetic, intricate designs of Dominion craftsmanship woven into his flesh. Sylva inhaled sharply. They augmented you. Terk huffed a weak laugh. That's a nice way of putting it. Rael didn't blink. And you escaped. Terk gritted his teeth. Barely. His gaze flicked to Sylva. You're running from them too, aren't you? Sylva stiffened. That's none of your concern. Tarek's weak smile widened slightly. They're always looking for the next project. If they wanted you bad enough to chase you across the sector, I'm guessing you've got something they want. Rael stepped forward, towering over him. Why were they transporting you? Tarek hesitated. Rael's patience snapped. He grabbed the front of Tarek's torn jacket, hauling him upright. Why? Tarek winced, his body weak, but his eyes weren't broken. They still held that damnable edge of defiance. Because I wasn't the only one, he muttered. They have more, hundreds, maybe thousands. Dominion's been building something, and whatever it is, it's big. Sylva turned to Rael, her expression grave. If that's true, Rael cut her off. We're not getting involved. Sylva blinked. Rael, no, he snapped. This isn't our fight. Tarek let out a dry, humorless chuckle. It was always your fight, Kovach. Rael's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched on his weapon. He could feel it, the past trying to drag him back in, not this time. He took a step back, releasing Tarek, who slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. Rael turned to Sylva. Patch him up, but after that he's off this ship. Sylva's silver eyes flashed. You don't get to decide that. Rael leaned in, voice low, dangerous. This ship, my rules. Sylva held his gaze, her own sharp with defiance. But she didn't argue. Instead, she turned to Tarek, scanning him again. We need to stabilize you before your nervous system crashes. Tarek smirked. See, at least one of you has a heart. Rael ignored him. He was already moving toward the cockpit, jaw clenched, mind racing. This wasn't a coincidence. Tarek showing up here now. This was the start of something bad, and Rael had a sinking feeling he wouldn't be able to run from it. Rael stood in the cockpit, hands braced against the console, eyes fixed on the distant asteroid belt stretching across the void. His mind churned. Tarek's words echoed in his head. Hundreds, maybe thousands. If the Dominion was mass-producing cybernetic soldiers, they weren't just expanding their army. They were creating something worse, something unstoppable. And Sylva, she was already too close to this. A quiet shuffle behind him made him tense, but he didn't turn. He knew who it was before she spoke. You're not going to just throw him out there, Sylva said, her voice controlled but sharp. Rael exhaled. I don't have time for this. Sylva stepped closer. You don't have time for what? Doing the right thing? Rael turned to her, his expression unreadable. This isn't about right or wrong, it's about survival. Sylva's silver eyes flashed. And what happens when the Dominion comes for us next, when they send their weapons after us? Rael scoffed. Then we do what we always do, we run. Sylva shook her head. Not this time. Something about the way she said it made Rael pause. She took a breath, her fingers curling into fists. I've been running since the day I stole the core. And for what? To buy time, to delay the inevitable. She stepped in closer, tilting her head, her bioluminescent markings pulsing faintly. You think you're keeping yourself safe by staying out of this fight, but all you're doing is waiting for it to catch up to you. Rael clenched his jaw. Sylva pressed on. You didn't have to save me back on the colony, but you did. You didn't have to take in Tarek, but you let him live. Her voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. You don't just run, you choose who to fight for, and you've already chosen us. Rael exhaled slowly, dragging a hand through his hair. Sylva's gaze softened. If we do this, we do it together. The weight of her words settled between them. Rael stared at her, really stared at her. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't wavering. And damn it, he knew she was right. He cursed under his breath, shaking his head. You're going to get me killed, Sylva smirked. Not if I keep you alive first. Rael huffed, rolling his shoulders. All right. His storm-gray eyes met hers. What's the plan? Sylva's lips parted slightly, like she hadn't expected him to actually agree. Then she straightened. All business. We need to find out where the Dominion is keeping their soldiers, and we have exactly one person who might have the answer. Rael exhaled, glancing back toward the medbay. Tarek. Then let's see what our old friend has to say. He turned and walked past Sylva, their shoulders brushing. A brief, fleeting touch. She didn't pull away, neither did he. And for the first time, Rael wasn't running from this. He was running toward it. Tarek sat on the edge of the medbay cot, rolling his synthetic fingers, watching how the metal flexed and shifted over what little remained of his flesh. Sylva had stabilized him, but he still looked rough, gaunt, exhausted, barely holding himself together. Rael didn't care. The moment Tarek had recognized him, everything changed. Rael leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Start talking. Tarek looked up, smirking faintly. No thank you for not bleeding out on my floor. Rael's patience was razor-thin. I should have left you in that pod, Tarek chuckled, shaking his head. But you didn't. Sylva stood beside Rael, her arms folded, glowing eyes sharp. You said the Dominion is building something. What exactly? Tarek exhaled, glancing at his metal hand. They call it Project Revenant. Rael's stomach twisted. He had heard whispers of something like that back when he was still Dominion. Speculation, rumors, but nothing concrete. Tarek flexed his fingers. They're not just making soldiers, Kovach. They're making useless soldiers, disposable assets. Flesh and metal stitched together in a way that no one survives for long. Most of the test subjects don't last a year before their minds break. Sylva's markings pulsed with alarm. You're saying they're designed to fail? Tarek's smirk was bitter. They're not making warriors, Doc. They're making weapons. Killers who don't need rest, don't need food, just a little time before they burn out. And when they do, he met Rael's gaze, they replace them. Rael inhaled slowly. How many? Tarek hesitated. Then, thousands. Sylva stiffened. Rael pushed off the wall, his hands curling into fists. This was what he had feared. The Dominion didn't care about wars anymore. They were planning extermination, and Sylva's stolen core, it was the missing piece. Tarek saw the realization hit them. Yeah, that little device you stole, Doc, it's not just power, it's the key to making sure these soldiers never shut down. Sylva's breath hitched. They're trying to make them permanent. Rael exhaled sharply. Where's the facility? Tarek hesitated. Rael stepped closer, voice cold. Where? Tarek smirked, shaking his head. There's the Kovach I remember. Sylva watched the exchange carefully. If we find it, we can destroy it. Rael looked at her. She wasn't hesitating, she wasn't backing down, she wanted to finish this. Tarek sighed. It's a deep space facility, no official records, no routes, but I know where the Dominion sends its failures. Rael's jaw tightened. And Tarek's expression darkened. There's one place the Dominion doesn't patrol, a graveyard. They dump the ones that don't make the cut, leave them floating in the black. If we find that, we find the facility. Sylva swallowed hard. How long do we have? Tarek's gaze flickered. Not long. If they finish integrating the core's data, we won't be able to stop them. Rael nodded, turning to Sylva. Can you track it? Sylva's markings pulsed faintly. I can modify the scanner frequencies. If Tarek's right, I can find the energy residue from failed augmentations. Rael exhaled. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. He looked at Tarek. You're coming with us. Tarek raised a brow. What happened to tossing me out an airlock? Rael smirked humorlessly. Don't tempt me. Sylva glanced between them. We should move now. Rael nodded. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about ending something before it could begin. And for the first time, Rael was choosing the fight. The Obsidian Dawn tore through space, its engines humming with an urgency that matched the tension inside the cockpit. The coordinates Tarek had given them led to a sector known only as the Wastes, a forgotten stretch of black where derelict ships and failed Dominion experiments were left to drift, silent and lifeless. Rael adjusted their course, his grip firm on the controls. Sylva sat beside him, eyes fixed on the scanner display, rapidly modifying the ship's sensor array to detect traces of the failed augmentations. Tarek leaned against the bulkhead behind them, arms crossed, watching them work. We're close, Sylva murmured, fingers dancing over the console. Energy signatures are weak, but they're there. Rael exhaled sharply. Then let's see what the Dominion's been trying to hide. As they approached the outskirts of the sector, the viewport filled with wreckage. Drifting husks of ships, twisted metal, floating debris that had once been part of something alive. Then they saw them, bodies, hundreds, maybe thousands, suspended in the void, frozen and lifeless, their forms warped with mechanical augmentations that had failed them. Sylva sucked in a sharp breath. They just left them. Rael's jaw clenched. They weren't soldiers, they were tests. Tarek's voice was quieter now. Told you. Sylva's hands curled into fists, her markings pulsing erratically. They never even gave them a choice. Rael forced himself to breathe. This wasn't war, it was slaughter, and the Dominion was perfecting it. Sylva's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. I've got something. Rael turned as she magnified a section of the scanner display. There's an energy signature in the debris field, different from the rest, active. Rael's eyes narrowed. Could be a Dominion relay, a data link. Tarek nodded. If it's still transmitting, it's probably feeding intel back to the facility. Sylva adjusted the ship's trajectory. If we tap into it, we can trace the signal to its source. Rael exhaled. It was a risk. If the Dominion picked up their interference, they'd be on them fast, but they didn't have time for caution. Do it, he said. Sylva nodded, working fast. She rerouted power to the comms array, isolating the data frequencies. Her bioluminescent markings flickered, shifting with her concentration. Rael's fingers drummed against the console as they waited. Seconds stretched. Then I have it, Sylva whispered. A direct link. She pulled up the data. A location flickered on the screen, a hidden Dominion facility. Rael's stomach tightened. There it is. Sylva met his gaze. What's the plan? Rael's storm-gray eyes were steady. We go in. Terk smirked weakly. That's a hell of a plan. Rael ignored him, turning to Sylva. How long before they notice we're tapping into their network? Sylva hesitated, checking the readings. Not long. Rael made his decision. We hit them before they have a chance to shut us out. Sylva nodded. I'll start masking our signature, but once we get closer, we'll need a distraction. Rael glanced at Terk. You up for that? Terk rolled his synthetic fingers. Long as I don't get shot in the head. Rael smirked. No promises. Sylva exhaled, shifting in her seat. This is it then. Rael looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. She had chosen this fight, and so had he. He reached for the thruster controls, eyes locked on the distant coordinates. The Dominion didn't know what was coming, but they would soon. Rael pushed the ship forward, the Obsidian Dawn cutting through the black toward the final battle. The Obsidian Dawn streaked toward the Dominion facility, its modified shielding keeping them off long-range scans for now. The station loomed in the distance, nestled in the black void, surrounded by the cold husks of failed experiments. It wasn't a shipyard. It wasn't a base. It was a graveyard that hadn't been filled yet. Sylva worked furiously at the console, feeding false data to Dominion scanners. We're masked, but only for a few minutes. Rael tightened his grip on the controls. That's all we need. Terk sat behind them, flexing his mechanical fingers. You really think 3 people can take down a Dominion facility? Rael smirked. You should have seen what we did with 4. Sylva shot him a look but didn't argue. They didn't have time. The plan was reckless. Dangerous, but it was the only shot they had. Sylva would disable the station's core systems remotely. Rael and Terk would breach from the docking bay, plant charges on the main reactor, and make sure Project Revenant died before it could ever be unleashed. Simple, until alarms blared through the cockpit. Damn it, Sylva hissed, fingers flying across the display. They're trying to break through our masking signal. Rael's jaw clenched. How long before they make us? Sylva exhaled sharply. Minutes. Terk cracked his knuckles. Then let's make them count. Rael pushed the ship forward, skimming the outer debris field. He maneuvered fast and low, using the station's own blind spots against it. The docking bay was just ahead. Sylva's voice was steady. I'll keep them blind as long as I can, but if we don't move fast, we will, Rael cut in. He brought the Obsidian Dawn in fast and rough. The moment the landing gear locked into place, Rael was already on his feet, sidearm in hand. Terk smirked. Just like old times. Rael glanced at Sylva. We'll be back. Sylva hesitated, then nodded. Try not to die. Rael gave her a cocky grin. No promises. Then he and Terk were gone, slipping into the facility's dimly lit corridors. The Dominion was already on alert, but that didn't matter. They weren't here to fight their way out. They were here to end this. Rael moved like a ghost, his years of training guiding his every step. Terk followed, moving smoother than Rael expected for a man with half his body replaced by metal. The deeper they went, the worse it got. Rows of containment pods lined the walls. Inside, figures twitched, half human, half machine, their minds locked in some nightmarish limbo. Failed experiments. Terk exhaled slowly. This is worse than I thought. Rael didn't look away. That's why we're here. He set the first charge against the reactor conduit. Then the alarms changed. Terk cursed. They found us. Rael turned toward the hall just as Dominion soldiers poured in. Go, he barked. Terk moved, setting the second charge as Rael opened fire, dropping the first 2 guards before they could react. But the Dominion wasn't unprepared. More soldiers rushed in, weapons raised. Rael ducked behind cover as a barrage of plasma fire tore through the corridor. Sylva's voice crackled over comms. Rael, the station's security grid just activated. I can't shut it down remotely. Rael grit his teeth. Then we do it the hard way. Terk slammed the last charge in place. Done. Rael glanced down at the detonator. They had seconds before reinforcements cut them off completely. He made a choice. Terk, get back to the ship. Terk frowned. That's not the plan. Rael's gaze was steely. The plan just changed. Terk hesitated. Rael didn't. He shoved the detonator into Terk's hands. You want to make it count, go. For once, Terk didn't argue. He bolted. Rael turned back toward the incoming soldiers, rolling his shoulders. Then he charged. The Dominion hadn't faced a soldier like him in years. He moved like a force of nature, fast, brutal, efficient. They fired. He dodged. He struck. 1, 2, 3 down. Then pain ripped through his side, a plasma shot burning hot. Rael grunted, staggering, but he didn't stop. He drove his elbow into a soldier's throat, stole his weapon, and fired point-blank. Then another, and another, but more were coming. Too many. He was out of time. The comms crackled. Rael now, Sylva's voice. Rael clenched his jaw, pushing through the pain. He turned, sprinting for the docking bay. Terk was already inside the Obsidian Dawn, the ship's engines roaring to life. Sylva was at the controls, eyes flashing. Get in. Rael didn't slow. He leaped, catching the ramp just as Sylva hit the thrusters. The Obsidian Dawn rocketed out of the docking bay, the station growing smaller behind them. Terk held up the detonator. Rael met his gaze, then nodded. Terk pressed the trigger. The explosion tore through the void, fire and metal erupting as the Dominion's facility, their project, their nightmare, was reduced to nothing. Silence filled the cockpit. Rael exhaled, leaning back against the wall, pain lacing through his body. Sylva turned to him, eyes searching. You're hit. Rael smirked weakly. You should see the other guys. She huffed, shaking her head. Idiot. Terk chuckled, slumping into a seat. Hell of a way to go out. Rael rolled his shoulders. Not out yet. Sylva studied him for a long moment. Then, before Rael could react, she stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his. It was brief, barely a touch, but it was warm, real, a silent understanding. Rael exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment. Then he looked at her. We're free, she whispered. Rael nodded. The Dominion was still out there, but Project Revenant was gone, and for the first time in years, Rael wasn't running. He had chosen this. He had chosen them. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The Obsidian Dawn drifted through the quiet void, the remnants of the Dominion facility fading into the distance. The explosion had left a debris field, scattered metal and ruined infrastructure floating aimlessly, evidence that Project Revenant would never reach completion. Rael sat in the co-pilot's seat, wincing slightly as Sylva pressed a sterilized cloth to the burn on his side. Hold still, she muttered, her silver eyes flickering with concentration. Rael smirked but didn't move. You're surprisingly good at this. Sylva huffed, dabbing at the wound with careful precision. Vashari scientists are trained in multiple disciplines, medicine included. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed faintly. But you already knew that. Rael tilted his head slightly. Did I? Sylva's gaze flicked to him, searching, like she was reading something unspoken. You understand more about my people than you let on. Rael exhaled through his nose. I understand you. The words were simple, matter of fact, but they sent something warm curling through Sylva's chest. She swallowed, refocusing on his wound. Well, that makes one of us. A comfortable silence settled between them. Terk leaned back in his seat across the cockpit, watching them with an amused expression. You two gonna keep dancing around this, or should I step outside and let you kiss already? Sylva stiffened, her markings flashing briefly in surprise. Rael just smirked. Don't push your luck, Voss. Terk chuckled but let it drop. Sylva shook her head, turning her attention back to the controls. What now? Rael exhaled, shifting slightly. The Dominion would come looking eventually. They always did. But without Project Revenant, they had lost something valuable. We find somewhere to lay low, Rael said finally. Get you back to your people. Sylva hesitated, fingers trailing along the console. Terk arched a brow. You don't sound thrilled about that. Sylva's expression was unreadable. I don't know if they'll take me back. Rael frowned. You risked your life to stop the Dominion. If they don't take you back, they're idiots. Sylva smirked faintly. They aren't idiots, but they don't trust easily. Rael studied her, something unreadable in his storm-gray eyes. Then what do you want? Sylva hesitated. What did she want? For so long, her goal had been survival, getting the energy core away from the Dominion, keeping it out of their hands. But now that it was over, now that she had won, she felt untethered, like she had lost the one thing keeping her moving forward. Her silver eyes met Rael's. He was waiting for her answer for her. And for the first time she let herself consider it, not just running, not just surviving, but choosing. Her gaze softened, the glow of her markings pulsing steadily. She stepped closer, slow, deliberate, standing just within reach. And Rael didn't move. She tilted her head the way she always did when considering something. I could go back. Rael arched a brow. Could, Sylva's lips twitched, or I could see where this goes. Rael exhaled, shaking his head with a smirk. You really are reckless, Sylva smirked back. Efficient, Terk groaned. Stars help me, that's flirting. Rael ignored him, holding Sylva's gaze. You sure about this? Sylva's silver eyes were steady. Yes. Rael didn't hesitate. He closed the distance, slow but certain, until his forehead rested against hers. The gesture was small, subtle, but it meant everything. Sylva inhaled, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of his presence settle in her chest. Terk exhaled dramatically. Finally, Rael snorted, stepping back. All right, don't get emotional. Terk grinned. Me? Never. Sylva chuckled, shaking her head. We should get moving. Rael took his seat at the controls, adjusting their heading. Where to? Sylva glanced at him, something playful in her expression. You do like improvising, Rael smirked. Guess I'm getting used to it. The obsidian dawn roared to life, cutting through the void, no longer running, no longer lost, just moving forward together. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, a vast ocean of darkness flecked with distant light. The ship hummed with the steady rhythm of engines running smooth, cutting through the void with practiced ease. They had escaped. They had survived, but nothing felt finished. Riker stood near the cockpit, arms crossed as he watched Dane and his crew celebrate in the main hold. A few of them laughed over drinks, counting credits from whatever deal they'd just closed. Dane, ever the opportunist, had already begun negotiating the best way to sell the stolen prototype. But Riker wasn't listening. His gaze drifted to Saris. She was seated near the viewport, staring out into the abyss, her expression unreadable. The soft glow of her bioluminescent markings pulsed faintly, casting a subtle light against her dark skin. She looked untethered, like she had escaped one war only to realize she had nowhere else to go. Riker pushed off the bulkhead and made his way to her. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside her, letting the silence stretch between them. After a long pause, Saris spoke. Dane is selling the prototype. Riker nodded. Figured, Saris exhaled slowly. That technology, it was meant to end wars. Now it'll be sold to whoever can afford it. There was something tired in her voice. Not anger, not regret, just exhaustion. Riker watched her, then leaned back against the seat. You could take it. Saris turned to him, brow raised. He shrugged. We could take it. A small scoff left her lips. And do what? Become fugitives. We already are. Riker smirked. Exactly. No rules, no orders, just us. Saris stared at him, and for the first time there was no guarded edge to her expression, no calculated distance, just quiet contemplation. The idea hung between them, fragile and unspoken, a life beyond war, beyond orders, beyond the things that had defined them. Saris exhaled, shaking her head. You're reckless, Riker grinned. You love it. She didn't deny it. And then in a movement so small, so subtle, she leaned closer. Her fingers brushed his, a feather-light touch that sent something electric through him. Riker stilled. She wasn't asking, she was deciding. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his hand over, letting her fingers slip against his palm. He curled his around hers, warm and solid. No words were needed. The universe stretched wide before them, uncertain and uncharted. But for the first time, neither of them were lost. Together, they had a choice, and they were going to take it.